Welcome to Stories and Spoilers, the podcast. Everyone, I am so excited for this episode because I am featuring a brilliant horror author. This is someone who is writing a story that has pregnancy, demons, social media, my cat sneezing in the background. This is Saratoga Schaefer. They have crafted an amazing horror book called Tradwife, which comes out February 10th of this year. And without further ado, this is Saratoga.
Hi,
Yay!
thank you for having me. I'm excited to chat.
Thank you for coming on. Can you tell us a little bit more about you and what pulled you into horror writing?
Yeah, so I have been writing for my entire life, but my debut novel just came out last year, March 2025. And my debut is a thriller, but I like to say that if you squint, it's a horror because it's about serial killers and a support group for serial killers and them kind of being very slashery with each other. So while that was technically a thriller, I went really hard into horror for my second book, which is Tradwife. And horror has always been very attractive to me because I am a very anxious person and I feel like horror is an amazing outlet for anxiety and for anything really. I think there's a lot of freedom in horror that allows you to kind of explore things that are happening in real life in a way that maybe feels safe, which is interesting because it's horror, so it's not safe, like as a rule. But that is why I'm very interested in it and why I kind of dove right in with my second book. And I'm really excited for it. I hope people like it. I think it's very deranged, which is on brand for me,
Hmm.
and I can't wait.
I wanted to ask, how would you describe Tradwife?
Yeah, so I'll just give a little like quick pitch about what it's about. So Tradwife is kind of what it sounds like. It's about a Tradwife influencer who is desperate to have a baby. So she enlists the help of a creature she finds in the well on her property, and she ends up having a very hungry, very demonic child. And it's unhinged and there's quite a bit of a body horror in there, and it's kind of like the new term I think we're throwing around is femgore, which I love, so it's kind of
Mm.
that. And yeah, it's just I think it's very fun. It's quite twisted, but it's a pretty a pretty thorough encapsulation of the whole tradwife phenomenon and a big focus on social media and how that shows up in that space as well. So it was a very interesting book to write.
I am so excited to dive into Tradwife. The description on Goodreads, the snippet that pulled me in was a traditional wife influencer allows a demonic creature to impregnate her in this unnerving horror novel, perfect for fans of Night Bitch and Mary from the author of Serial Killer Support Group. Every Tradwife needs a baby, and she'll get one at any cost. Just that, for anyone who is familiar with tradwives on social media, you'll see people like Nara Smith, Ballerina Farms, allegedly. And a really creepy element of this story seems to be this segment of this persona of this perfect, well kept, beautiful woman who constantly is baking fresh bread or pizza or Cheerios individually from scratch, who has all the time in the world to be amenable to their partner. And yet their personality is the equivalent of Wonder Bread. So this is going to be a really interesting story to read because I'm excited to see how you depict this kind of woman and how that appears with something that's demonic, which seems like the polar opposite of this well kept pinnacle of perfection. So I don't know. I'm excited to see what you do with that. Does that description kind of describe it a bit well? I'm not sure.
100%. Yeah, yeah, it's perfect. And those are all great points because those are all things that I very much do explore in the book. And I mean, going into it, I love this recent spate of like books about tradwives and featuring tradwives. And I was really interested in doing something from only the point of view of that tradwife and really getting into the head of somebody who's a part of that community and why they might have been drawn to that community and what about their past and their history would make that very appealing to them.
Mm.
So Camille, who's the main character, or trad wife in question, is not necessarily likable, and there's a reason for that, but she has a very strong character arc because, like you said, it's, demon pregnancy and trad wife don't really go together. So I wanted to see what would happen if we gave a situation like that to one of these women. How would they react? How would they behave? Why are they in the community in the first place? And that sort of journey that Camille goes through with her relationship with her baby, herself, and her husband is pretty interesting because I don't think it's not exactly what you would expect, which is interesting.
I'm so sorry. I am curious. Did Rosemary's Baby at all influence the story? I feel like that's kind of like obviously, possibly. But I'm curious because of this sense of like, what is this need for a baby? Where is this hunger? Is it social media and this sense of like there must be, she must be barefoot and pregnant and constantly running, or is it more so like a character study? And
Mm,
is it about like comparison and like what's expected of women? I know you can't spoil it, but I'm very
yeah.
curious. Like, where is this hunger for a baby coming from?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, for to your first point, there's definitely some Rosemary's Baby comparisons there. My publisher likes to say that it's Rosemary's Baby for the digital age because, it's contemporary and there's a lot of that social media stuff in there. It does differ quite a bit from Rosemary's Baby too, but I do think that's a good jumping off point where like if you enjoyed that book and or movie, you're going to also maybe be interested in Tradwife. Um, but yeah, that journey of where the story goes is one that was very intentional. I do think so. It's very isolated, it's very insulated. They've just recently moved to this house that's kind of in the middle of nowhere in the country, in the middle of a wheat field. And she's really excited because it fits in with her aesthetic. And she's like, oh my God, I'm going to have all these babies and the content's going to be great and all of that. So she really is only interacting with Graham, her husband, and then a neighbor who has taken an interest in her. But besides that, she's very much alone. So there is that kind of character study component where we're in Camille's head and we're seeing her go on this journey. We're in this journey with her. It's weird and kind of fucked up. And she's dealing with a lot of stuff, but we're right there with her. We're kind of stuck on this plot of property with her, and that's intentional. It's supposed to feel kind of like claustrophobic and like you can't escape because she can't escape, and that's sort of a metaphor for her lifestyle as well. So it's a little bit of both. It is this character study, but there's also quite a lot going on, even though her life maybe looks a little chill from the outside. She's got a lot happening. So that's all kind of explored at the same time as well.
There is a quote by Gillian Flynn that I've heard people say Gillian and Jillian. So, pardon my French, I'm not sure which way to pronounce it is correct. But there's a quote from Gillian Flynn that I always want to share with authors who write horror to see if this is a semblance of how they feel about writing women.
Mm.
And I was curious because she says something about there being a seed inside of every individual that with the right like foundation with the right occurrences can become evil. Everyone has that ability to kind of turn into that version of themselves. And I'm excited to see kind of what happens with her. And it's like, what are you willing to sacrifice to get what you want? Also curious about how you wrote this demon and kind of how you maybe researched that a little bit, what inspired this in your story, and like what was the first spark of inspiration for Tradwife?
Yeah. So the demon was really fun. So because the tradwife lifestyle has a lot of roots in religious background experiences, imagery, that was a very intentional addition to the story. So
Mm.
there's like biblical angels, there are fallen
Wow.
angels, there's a lot of sort of that traditional religious imagery and or exploration that comes into play in the book. So that was very interesting as somebody who grew up with that religion and then veered pretty severely away from it as I got older. It was cool to sort of explore that through a horror lens. So that was part of the inspiration for the demonic entity in this. And also the relationship between Camille and the demonic entity, I think people are going to find very intriguing and interesting, and again, might not be what they initially expect going into it. I won't say anymore because I don't want to spoil anything, but it's interesting. It's a little
Ooh,
spicy, so if people are looking for a little bit of spice, they might be getting that from this.
interesting.
And then the overall inspiration behind the book was actually very simple. I was having a text exchange with my younger sister, and I said something about tradwives, and she was like, "What's that?" And I was like, "Have you been living under a rock?" So I basically explained to her, what they were, what the whole thing was, and throughout the explanation, I started to get this idea and then started to pitch it to her because she's one of my first readers. And she was immediately like, yeah, I would read that. So, like a week after having that conversation, I started drafting and it just like came out of me. It was like the most fun I think I've ever had writing a book so far. And so it was great, but I'm excited.
I also want to learn a little bit more about you as a person and as a writer. And one of my big questions for you, I'm a huge fan of horror films, and I was curious, were there any horror films that visually may have inspired some of the characters in this story? Maybe a little bit of unhingedness from a film like Pearl, or maybe a little bit of the gore from something like X or Your Next. I'm really curious to see if there's any movies that are close to your heart in the horror genre that may have inspired the mood of Tradwife.
That's a great question. That's kind of like I have some layers to this. So
Ooh.
I'll start by saying I am actually not a super visual person. I can't really visualize things. Like obviously if I'm watching a movie, I can visualize the movie. But when I'm writing, I have no idea what my characters look like. I don't know where they are. I have to like look up pictures. I have to get, something in my head that I can work off of. It's hard for me to just imagine things unfurling like a TV show. So I don't know that there was anything I saw that was like a specific aesthetic that I related to. The other part of this is that I vastly prefer older horror movies. And one of the reasons for that, and this is going to sound insane, is I actually don't like seeing gore. I don't, it freaks me out. I have like a thing, I have like a bone breaking phobia. Like I can't do any of that. And a lot of modern horror movies, I feel like lean a bit too much on the gross out factor. And I much prefer things like jump scares or psychological horror, things that are like really getting inside your head,
Mm.
is why I tend to go back a little bit further. But yeah, so that's kind of like my weird horror author who doesn't always watch a ton of horror because they can't always handle it. But yeah, I mean, Rosemary's Baby, obviously, but also horror adjacent. The Shape of Water was pretty
Ooh.
inspirational to this as well. And I don't know if that aesthetic is exactly correct because it's interesting in the book. You'll see Camille has a very specific aesthetic, but
Mm.
that vibe, that kind of like, stuff is going down. There's a weird creature. There's a relationship happening. That kind of Guillermo del Toro stuff, like those
Mm.
kind of horror fantasy things, I am very attracted to.
Oh, I do want to ask you a rather broad question. What makes a good horror story?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. I think a good horror story looks different based on a couple different things, like who's telling it and how you're telling it. Because horror is such a spectrum nowadays, especially when you look, if you're lucky enough to have a bookstore that has a dedicated horror section, which some of them don't. But if you're lucky enough to have that and you look at that, there is usually quite a range where there's stuff that's like more visceral or historic or stuff that's horrifying because like it really happened or because
Mm.
we're currently going through it. And then you have like the wild fantastical horror that's like this could never happen but it's really scary. And then you have everything in between, like you have the monsters, you have zombies, you have ghosts, you have cannibalism, you have all the different things. But I think the thing that runs through all of them is that sense of uncertainty. You know, I think the comfort in things like romance novels is that you know there's going to be a happily ever after. You know that there are certain plot beats that are going to come and make sense, and that's soothing, even when they have their third act breakup and you're like, no, you know that's not the end.
Mhm.
Horror doesn't do that. Horror is like, cool, we're going to take all that stuff that you like and makes you comfortable, and we're going to flip it on its head and we're going to make you uncomfortable. And it
Mhm.
doesn't really matter what exactly you're writing about or where in that horror spectrum you fall, but it's that like unease where you're going into it and you're like, ugh, something about this is making me feel some kind of way that maybe I don't like. And I think
Mhm.
that's where the really good horror starts to stand out.
I absolutely love that description of it. There's a foreword in a book. It was a horror anthology, and it was from Stephen Graham Jones, of course. I actually am one of the stranger horror fans where I've only read like his short stories.
Mm.
I have one of his books I do plan on reading. But there was a line in this letter he wrote before the short stories occur. And he pretty much says you have to wade through lots of blood to get to the root of these stories. And he's like, take my hand. And he's like, follow me into the dark. I will like guide you. And then the short stories continue and they begin, and it sets the tone really beautifully. And I feel like that same energy is like when you're at a sleepover and everyone's telling like a scary story, or like when you're at school and there's like an urban legend and it gives you the spooks and it freaks you out. I think there's something about that same energy of like everyone has to walk home from school. Everyone has to take a shower, and then the mirror gets steamy, and you
Mhm.
think you feel someone behind you, or puberty in the sense of that your body is changing, your mind is changing. There's so many chemicals, no one understands you, that isolation. All and then you think of stories like Goosebumps. You know what I mean? Like you think of, I'm not a huge Stephen King fan, but like Carrie, you think of bullying and that anger and that internalized, you just want to control everything if you just had control. And then you put horror into that and it's like, oh, telekinesis. So I think that there's something about horror that is universal in a lot of ways, even if people don't love the genre. There's always some movie or some book that they can partially relate to. There's a little seed of truth under all that blood, and I just think that's so unique. Even in romance, as you said, that safety blanket, it gives the same energy as like the Babadook, or like, that the Grudge, like you get certain things where it's like, okay, you've got grief on one hand, you've got revenge and anger on the other. Female rage, one of my favorite book tropes ever, where it's just an entire genre of women who are like, I've had enough. And I'm like, this is fantastic. I only referenced Pearl, the film, because there's a scene where she goes, I'm a star. And someone really like upsets her and she does something. I don't want to spoil it, but she cracks. And it's like, you see, the anger was always there, but eventually it just explodes. And I just love it. I like how it subverts what you think is going to happen, especially in books. When I'm reading something and I think I've gotten to the very end of the story, the monster's been revealed, the bodies have dropped. You think you've gotten out of the woods, you think you're scot free, you got to the car, and then you get in the back seat and your best friend's like, "Oh, so I'm the monster." There's something about that last like twist, that like creeping feeling that it's like you never really got out in horror. I don't know why. Like that same energy is like Silent Hill, where you think you're out, but you never really escaped. I don't know. Some of the best horror, I'm like, who's the real monster here? Like what's going on here? And I just can't wait to read your book. I'm so excited for it to come out in February, because I really loved your first book, and now I'm like prepared, for something amazing. So yeah.
Thank you. I'm very excited too. Hopefully you like it.
No, I'm sure it's going to be great. And one of my last questions for you is, what was your favorite part about writing Tradwife? And what do you want listeners to know about it before reading?
Yeah, my favorite part about writing Tradwife was I think just the drafting process. Like I said,
Mm.
it's the most fun I've ever had writing a book. I wrote it very fast. It kind of all came out of me. I was also getting kind of burned out on my first book because I wrote Tradwife before Serial Killer Support Group came out. And when you go through the publishing process, you write the book, great, the book sells, wonderful. And then you have to reread the book like 400 times in 6 months and like just do all these different rounds of edits. And I was at the end of it and I was like, I'm so sick of this book. Like, I really can't think about it anymore. And this was like my reward when I finished all my edits for Serial Killer Support Group, was to just write this deranged idea that was like swimming around in my head. So that was just, there was a lot of like release and relief there of like, cool, I'm moving on to the next thing and like writing something new. And I have that like ADHD brain of like, pivot, time to like move on to the next thing. Now we're fixated on this. So that was really, really enjoyable. And it was a very fun experience. And I hope that that kind of comes through, because the book has some very dark moments. It has some dark sections. There's, like I said earlier, there's quite a bit of body horror. So I would also just like, if you're pregnant or you're getting pregnant or you just gave birth, maybe like chill for a minute before reading this, unless you're really in that mindset and you're like, yeah, I want a demon baby, then go for it. But I think there's also a little bit of that kind of like campy quality to it as well. So I hope people are excited to dive into it and are kind of ready for themselves to be put in the point of view of a trad wife, and maybe see something about it that they didn't expect, and just kind of go on this journey with Camille and see where she ends up, because it might surprise you.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Where can they find Tradwife when it comes out? And where can they find you on social media?
Yeah, you can find Tradwife anywhere books are sold. If you pre-order it early, so before February 10th, and you send your pre-order receipt to marketing@crookedlanebooks.com, you will get a free sticker sheet and you'll get a signed book plate so you could put it in your book. So you'll essentially have a signed book, which is great. And then people can find me pretty much anywhere online at the same handle, which is Saratoga is here. And you can also find me at my website, which is saratogaschaefer.com.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Everyone, please check out Tradwife by Saratoga Schaefer. Comes out February 10th of 2026. This episode is actually coming out before the book comes out. So this was like a teaser for you if you wanted to dip your toes into some demonic pregnancy, spooky books. And honestly, you're such an amazing author. I'm beyond grateful you came on. I'm so happy. And I hope everyone reads your book. You're wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Yes, of course. Everyone who listened, please subscribe on YouTube, like if you can, leave a nice comment, check out this book, and follow on Spotify. I will see y'all later, and I hope you enjoyed this scary episode. Bye.